Okay, why don't you, why don't you start? And we're getting a double thing here in order for you to hear me.
Okay,
Why don't you start?
I'll go ahead and get started then.
Okay, thank you, Patrick.
Sure.
Will you introduce yourself a little bit too?
Say again?
Will you introduce yourself?
I will indeed. Good morning, everyone. My name is Pat Sweeney. I'm going to be providing you an overview from about the invasion of Ukraine. Give you an idea of the Russian goals and implications to the U.S. and to the world. First of all, I want to make clear these are my views and not the views of the Citadel or the Naval War College, both of which where I teach. Just a little background. I'm a retired Army officer and served 29 years in the Army. One of my jobs is I was also a war planner. And so my last war planning position was I was in charge of the planning for Bosnia and Kosovo while I was with NATO. And from there, then I was stationed at the Naval War College in Rhode Island, which is where I met Pam. And now I teach at the Citadel in our intelligence and security studies department. So what I plan to do is provide you an overview, a variety of things to be considering. And at the end, if you get any questions and answers that I might be able to provide. Okay, so let me get started first. That you really can't talk about this conflict without first about talking about geography, because it is all about geography. And understanding that Ukraine, size of Texas, second largest country in Europe, with Russia being the number one. And so Ukraine itself, the key item is, of course, as most of you are familiar with, is that the Russians annexed the Crimea in 2014 and then provided support to the separatists also in the Donetsk area. Other thing, keep in mind, Belarus to the north is truly just a vassal state to Russia, very much aligned with them. We'll talk a bit more about that in a few moments on this. So, and you keep seeing pictures like this when you think about geography, but when you also talk about Ukrainian geography, you really got to look at the terrain itself, and it has implications for challenges for the Russians and the operations they're conducting. So you'll see that many of their successes have been in the plains areas, and their approach from Belarus up through here. But the big challenge, of course, are the Carpathian Mountains in this area, in this region, which would be very difficult for the Russians to operate in. And much so what you see are the Russians being tethered to the road networks. And this is the muddy season now in Ukraine. So you get off the roads, it's pretty hard to move. And so this is one of the challenges as well on that. The other area to consider when we talk about the geography piece is everyone else in the area. And this is really what the driving force is and concern of the West and certainly of NATO. Understanding that all of the countries that border Ukraine, except Moldova, are all, and Belarus, are all members of NATO. And when you say they're members of NATO, then we're talking about NATO that can use the Article 5, which is if you attack my country, you're attacking all my countries, and then that means war. And so while our focus is certainly on Ukraine, all of the other flank countries are very, very concerned themselves, because they have certainly conscious memories of being under Soviet control on that aspect. The other piece is Moldova, though, as I mentioned, is not in NATO. And we'll talk about later some of the challenges they have potentially there. The big concern in the Baltic region, of course, unlike Ukraine, which is a very large landmass, these are very small countries. They're all bordered by Russia or Belarus, and they can be easily overcome by attack both by ground and by sea. So these countries have a vested interest in a NATO that is focused on this particular threat. And of course, Poland is used to being a doormat for invading countries over the time period, and very, very much fear a Russian threat as well. And this is why they are the primary conduit of support right now, their landmass into Ukraine, and they are supporting it quite well. So let's just take a look at a little bit of the history. And I think that's pretty important, mainly because Putin has distorted the history somewhat. Ukraine, they have been under a variety of different empires over the course of time, and ultimately Bolsheviks secured them back in 1919. One thing that is certainly deep in the conscience of all Ukrainians is the mass famine of 32 and 33, where they had millions die, and Stalin essentially really wanted this and allowed this to occur. Now we get to 1991, the collapse of the Soviet Union. Ukraine is now a free country. Well, when they were free, USSR had a lot of the nuclear delivery weapon systems were positioned in Ukraine. And so that made them, I want to say, the third largest nuclear capable country in the world. So in 1994, the Budapest Memorandum was an agreement that Ukraine would surrender these nuclear weapons back to Russia or have them deactivated, with the guarantee from Russia of their security, that they would not come in and try to take any of their territory. And of course, we see how useful that agreement was in retrospect. 2013, massive protest against the Russian-friendly president at the time, and he was removed from office. At this point, this is where Russia becomes quite concerned that he sees Ukraine now leaning westward versus staying in his orbit. And shortly after, as you can see in 2014, is when Russia seized the Crimea and the Donbass region on the southeastern side bordering Russia. And that's been in place now until this current invasion. And while there's not been any major fighting around Crimea in the intervening time, there has been substantial fighting between Ukraine and the Donbass region since 2014 on that. And it's important to keep in mind that the ease of Russia being able to seize both of those areas in 2014 has influenced substantially their operation here in recent time. So they've made some assumptions based on how easy it was to overcome Ukraine at that point. And I should mention, since 2014, the US and some other nations have been providing support and training to the Ukrainian military. And so they are a substantially different organization than they were in the 2014 timeframe. And you have a lot of Ukrainian soldiers that have now had combat experience fighting in the Donbass region. So things have changed quite a bit from there. The other thing weighing heavily on Russia as their experiences was their actions in Syria. And all of their actions in Syria were on social media, to include them leveling cities in Syria, and Syrians' continued use of chemical weapons. No matter what red line that we appeared that we had made, they continued to use chlorine gas in Syria while Russia was there. And of note, Putin didn't see any big pushback from the West on that. And so these two things combined together to, I think, embolden the Russian government. So what are their goals? Their near term is they want Ukraine out of that Western orbit. They want them back towards an Eastern view towards Russia. Of course, they're very much concerned about the discussion of potentially bringing Ukraine into NATO, which has not been discussed for a couple, 3 years now, but it was mentioned, and we need to be upfront on that. They really, really seek a land bridge from Russia to the Crimea Peninsula that they've already secured. And this is ultimately might be a means of their end game, is at least having that. And they're close to securing that right now at this point in time. Control of the Donbass region. These were the two separatist states that Putin recognized just before starting this conflict, and make them then again part of our Russia at some point in time. And they want to make it very clear that the Crimea does not belong to Ukraine, but belongs to Russia. And that's very important for them because that's where their fleet would be. Next up, if I was sitting in Moldova, I would be very nervous. You already have Russian soldiers stationed in Moldova. And so one of the concerns is going to be is that right after they achieve whatever goals they want in Ukraine, they can just swing in and then take Moldova as well. Again, Moldova, not part of NATO, so there's not an Article 5 response there. And as I already mentioned, the Baltic nations, very nervous and very vulnerable to a Russian attack. And so these are probably the most concerning next steps after Ukraine. Now, who are the enablers of Russia? First and foremost, China. As all of you are pretty aware, is that Russia and China have a close relationship now. Now, understand, China historically doesn't have alliances. They have accommodations with other countries, and for the most part, Russia to them is a vassal state, and so they will do what's in their best interest. But it should be noted, the control or the influence China does have on Russia is that, and most of us that were looking at this figured this would occur, is that Russia would not start this war while the Olympics were going on. And I'm sure Big Brother China told him, hey, Putin, don't do that monkey business until we finish. And you will note the invasion didn't start until the last day of the Olympics that they actually went across. Belarus is the other enabler. Belarus is in the Russian orbit at this point in time. They had some massive protests in 2020, and those were suppressed. And so right now, Belarus should be considered essentially an extension of Russia. And of course, one of the attacking columns into Ukraine came out of Belarus. And of course, it borders up against all of these other NATO nations as well. Smaller nation, only 10 million there compared to 40 some odd million in Ukraine. But at any rate, one to keep in mind. Population is being suppressed. So you should anticipate the leadership is not as popular amongst the full population, but the iron hold of Russia will certainly keep control of Belarus because that's in their interest to do so. But who are some of the others? I always find very interesting as we need to talk about the Russian Orthodox Church, is that the Russian Orthodox Church fully supports the invasion. And in fact, Patriarch Kirill that you see here is very close to Putin, and Putin uses the church, the Orthodox Church, really as a cloak for much of what he does, and always has a visible linkage between him and the Orthodox Church. It should be noted that the head of the Orthodox Church, as you see here, was actually a KGB agent too, just like Putin was at some point in time. And so this is one aspect that distorts it and supports the current operation, and is a major enabler from Putin's perspective. The state-controlled media is a major element for Russia to keep its own population in control. And so they continue to feed their propaganda, their message to the Russian population. And so the vast majority of the Russian population support the war and support Putin because this is the only angle they hear and see. And most of you have seen in the media that if anybody that speaks up or protests, they're immediately locked up and dealt with. And so as our own resources pull out of Russia and our technology companies, then that's even fewer conduits of another view getting to the Russian people. So that's a major aspect, and I would anticipate that we're trying to get around that at this point in time. We all know, of course, the petroleum leverage that the Russians have on Europe and a good chunk of the other nations. They're essentially a giant gas station, and while they only have the GDP of about the size of Italy, this is still an outsized control aspect that they do have, and it'll be a key aspect of not only Western Europe, but the rest of the world, is that how long we can keep everybody from getting wobbly knees and deciding, well, I really don't want to pay this much more for petroleum products, and that our pressure on Russia goes away. The other one that's pretty important to understand is that during the Soviet Union times, all of these countries that were consumed by the Soviet Union, Stalin put Russian citizens into those countries. And so what you'll find is there are very large ethnic Russian populations in most of these border nations with the old Soviet Union. And so what this means is this gives you, if you're Putin, leverage to go into any of these countries and an excuse that these ethnic Russians are being oppressed. And of course, one of his arguments was in Ukraine is there was genocide going on by the Ukrainian government against these ethnic Russians. And so this is the case also in the Baltic regions as well. And so you have these pockets to keep that in mind. And they're even given Russian passports on that end. Okay, obviously the one that's gotten most of the attention here in America, and it should be rightly so, is the massive refugee crisis that's ongoing right now. This is the largest flow of refugees in Europe since World War II. To give you some perspectives, this is, you're looking at about a little over 3 million that have been pushed out of the country of Ukraine. Now, I've highlighted down here where you'll see with Russia having 200,000, probably even more. Many of these have been forcibly repatriated to Russia and placed in filtration camps, where they, from there, will have all their papers taken away, all their Ukrainian identity, and then be dispersed in Russia itself. And so whether these become future hostages or what will actually become of them, it will certainly change the demographics of the occupied areas, because you would anticipate then some friendly Russian population being shifted back into those areas. And then we may see, well, let's have a referendum in these areas. And of course, they'll all be primarily Russian citizens that'll be there voting, yes, indeed, we want to go in. So a massive refugee flow. You can see the overwhelming numbers going into some of these countries like Poland that are picking this up. Now, President Biden just indicated he's going to be prepared to take on more refugees in America. So we'll see how that transpires. And again, these numbers are only the ones that have been ejected out of the country. There are still millions of other internally displaced refugees that have left their cities and homes within Ukraine, but are still in Ukraine itself, receiving support by other members in Ukraine. Now, this kind of gives you a proportional size. If we were talking about that population, look at the size of some of our cities. When you talk about the numbers of people that have moved out of Ukraine itself. So when you see every man, woman, and child in Chicago being displaced, that kind of gives you an idea. But I thought to really show you the implication, I think you got to look at ratios. When you apply the percentage of people that have been displaced from Ukraine, and you put this to America, if we had the same thing happen in America, that would be every man, woman, and child in New England, plus Pennsylvania, being displaced. That would be the equivalent of our nation if that same percentage was pushed out of our population itself. So, I mean, this gives you the magnitude of what Ukraine is going through, because you can imagine what this would be for ourselves. So what are we doing? Well, we are doing economic sanctions, and that will have little to no impact on Putin, and certainly in the short run, and in this operation. We've also been providing defensive weapons and intelligence. This is we didn't give a lot before, but now lots pouring in at this point in time, hopefully in sufficient time to do that. We have been training Ukrainian forces since 2014. Both our military have been in there, as well as a couple of other nations from NATO have been supporting training the Ukrainians on that, and what few defensive weapons we had sent in up at that point in time. A tip of the hat, though, to Elon Musk, and because he made his Starlink satellite system available to the Ukraine military, and it's being used very effectively by the military, bringing quite a bit of harm to the Russians with their ability to coordinate their fires on that. So no matter what you think of Elon Musk, at least he did that very well. The U.S. is managing the pipeline of all of this support that is going from Poland into Ukraine, and that's primarily our responsibility that we're doing U.S. military. Now in Europe, we already have, of course, we've drawn down from the Cold War days, but we already did have 80,000 forces in Europe at that point, which we did increase by September of 2021. In addition, we have already deployed, in addition to that, 15,000 ground forces, and some air power have been forward deployed now. Most of those are going to the further eastern countries of the alliance. There is another 8,000 on standby right now, ready to deploy, and I'm sure we could put more in if necessary. Again, none of these are going to Ukraine. They'd all be going to NATO nations on that. Initially, we had provided up to $200 million in aid to the refugees, and President Biden, just while in Poland, has just promised another $1 billion in aid to the refugees. And as you can see from the numbers, that's pretty important on that. So, what's Putin's strategy and challenges? First and foremost, he is, along as well as China and as well as Iran, are very much embraced the concept of hybrid warfare. And hybrid warfare essentially are multiple lines of operation, multiple approaches to their goals. And economic cyber, information, message control, use of proxies, criminals, and their conventional forces. And so this is a persistent threat going on, and we see this clearly in Ukraine. This is what they did in Georgia when they went on that. And this is going on in a variety of other nations, to include ourselves. We are targets of hybrid warfare as well. When you talk about the cyber, the economic, whether it's election tampering or whatever the case may be, this is the way they do it. The key is threshold avoidance, is that they stay just under that line where our response would be a heavy hammer come in and drop on them. And so that's why they're in Ukraine fighting right now, and that's why we are not, because the threshold has not been crossed that would cause us to get involved. And so this has been very effective up to really this point in time in their operations, whether it's Syria or those other countries I mentioned. Whether in fact he's overstepped it now, we'll see. The challenges that Putin follows, he did not anticipate NATO coalescing again. Is that and again, my last assignment in the military is I was a war planner in NATO. And with the Cold War, many of the NATO nations just really stopped investing in their defense, and all had their little petty perspectives. So now you really have, at least at this point, nations really starting to take a look at their defense requirements. Germany, in particular, just announcing their major investments they're going to make into their military, which has really dwindled in capability. And he did not expect that. And of course, the other challenge is his own internal control. I told you about he controls the media and the messaging. And so that's important for him to keep control of his population. If the population truly knew the real story, if that story had come out that they were killing their brother Russian Slavs, I mean, many would be in an uproar on that. The oligarchs, of course, they're the ones that have benefited tremendously from Putin in control. How much leverage they have on Putin, I'm not sure. He certainly has leverage on them. And then the impact of the economic part. Now, you need to keep in mind that Putin has been preparing his economy for these types of shocks up to this point in time. He is much better economically controlled than many of us in the West. They didn't have a deficit, and he's been stacking up his gold. And so he's had his economy pretty tightly held up to this point in time. And of course, he does have China to help out to some point. I'm not going to tell you they're not going to feel pain, but we'll have to see in the long run, though, if the economic aspect will eventually have some telling mark on it. Challenges for the U.S. is the obvious one: are we entering into a new Cold War? And that would be very unfortunate. We're already starting to see now. Of course, we're going to have to potentially reposition forces into Europe. And why is that important? Because our focus had been looking at China and that threat that is of a peer competitor in China, and that we'll have to trade off some of those resources that we were going to be putting in the Pacific and put it towards there. I think the big challenges for the U.S. will certainly be economic. One that causes me concern is the degradation of the dollar itself. You probably heard the term a couple of times of SWIFT, and this is essentially a conduit of, if you're going to buy something from another nation, it passes through this conduit of SWIFT, and this is how things that are exchanged. Well, we've all said we're tossing Russia out of SWIFT. So what they're doing is going to the Chinese equivalent of SWIFT and doing this in Chinese currency versus American dollars. Then you look at Saudi Arabia, and Saudi Arabia who we've already upset for a variety of reasons here in recent time, is talking to China about, instead of using the dollar as the means of selling petroleum, to maybe look at Chinese currency for that. Why is any of this important? Look at our deficit and look how much debt we have. And the reason we can still operate and we don't look like Greece is because of the strength of our dollar and the stability of our nation. At that point, any of that becomes in question, then there's a concern there on that. Inflation, of course, we had inflation before this has started. We had fuel inflation even before this, and so you can anticipate the fuel inflation will continue even at a higher level. You are all familiar with, I'm sure, that Russia and Ukraine are major world producers of wheat, and those will be heavily impacted. Fertilizer. I didn't realize this until the conflict started ramping up, that we were getting ready, is that we're a major importer of fertilizer, as well as the rest of the world, from Russia. And so you add wheat and fertilizer together, we're starting to have a major impact on the ability to grow crops worldwide, having a big issue. Nickel, again, a big exporter. One thing the U.S. has really allowed to falter over the years is we import a lot of our minerals now because many of these things are pollutants and as such, nickel, which is critical for stainless steel and batteries. I think all these electric vehicles we're talking about, again, major source of that, Russia. What's the impact going to be on all of that? Then we should anticipate hotspots of international famine occurring. First and foremost, because of this wheat and fertilizer being an issue. But the other issue is that there are many nations that are exporters of the various crops, which are right now holding off on exporting because they want to make sure their nation is secure and can be fed. And so even nations that were unhindered by any of this are holding back on exports of their food materials. So I believe we'll see this in the short run start to happen. And that's something to keep in mind as well. So what's NATO's role in all this? It's deterrence. Yeah, we used to be during the Cold War, we were a deterrence. We've lost that ability post-Cold War. And certainly at this point in time. So one major aspect, as I already mentioned earlier, is funding the militaries. And so a lot of these nations have allowed this to fall into ruin in their military. They need to fund it. They need to fund their military and to include our own nation. There are some real shortfalls that we have in the ability to do the job. And that we've got to be able to be postured where our forces are not positioned right now, the infrastructure for all these vulnerable countries that I've just mentioned earlier that are protected by Article 5. And so we should anticipate seeing forces starting to move towards the Baltics, certainly into Poland and other potentially threatened nations. This is what deterrence is. The Russians need to know if you attack in there, you're going to be bet by Americans too, and everything that means with it. And then we have to provide a unified stance. One of the challenges is there are some in Europe, which, by the way, was encouraged by the U.S. once upon a time, that would like to see a European response versus necessarily a NATO response. And we need to make sure that there aren't countries in NATO that are trying to cut side deals with Russia to give a more European perspective than a NATO perspective. And so this is just one to keep an eye on as well. And I'm talking about you, France. Potential threats. Obviously, the nuclear meltdown of any of these reactors, or if one gets destroyed in combat or intentionally sabotaged, which is one of the concerns. I can tell you, I was in Germany when Chernobyl happened, and in Germany, it was affected by that. You couldn't eat any food that was on the ground. You couldn't drink milk from cows that had grazed on the grass. So this has a major implication because anything that happens there will impact Western Europe, drifting over there on that end. The use of chemical weapons. I already told you, the Russians will certainly always consider chemical weapons. They've used them already a variety of times. And the real question that we have, and though we hear President Biden say that we'll respond in kind, you should understand we don't have chemical weapons anymore. And so even if we did, if they use chemical weapons, are we going to then start throwing chemical weapons in Ukraine? I wouldn't see that as an option at all. But that is a concern, and I think it's a very low threshold, I think, for Putin. And you've got to remember, the last time the Americans said chemical weapons are a red line in Syria, and the Syrians used a chemical weapon, well, they found out it really wasn't a red line. And so this is when your past begins to haunt you. And so this is one of the challenges, and I think it's a low threshold to reach for chemical weapons by the Russians. Now, use of tactical nuclear weapons. I would hope not. I would hope they would not be able to use the tactical nuclear weapons. And again, the challenge we'd have is, okay, if they use one, what are we going to do? We're not going to drop another tactical nuclear weapon ourselves on Ukraine. And of course, if I drop one in Russia, we're talking World War III. And so that's the quandary right now. The Biden administration's wrestling with is, what will our response be? We don't have many more economic things we can do. And so what will you do? And that's a challenge. And Putin realizes it. Again, they look what our response has been in the past. They look at what our options might be. But this is also where miscalculations can come from as well. The other item, which I think we should keep a close eye on, is that I already told you we have a massive amount of equipment and some people, volunteers that are passing through Poland that we're facilitating into Ukraine. Will Russia reach out and try to interdict that? And that means attacking these lines of communications in Poland, a NATO nation. Article 5. Would they do this? If they did, what next? But this is, from a military perspective, a pretty reasonable action. If you are fighting an enemy and they have a free flow of weapons coming into the country, you want to stop it. Now, right now, they're trying to stop it on the Ukrainian side of that pipeline, as you've seen recent times, them dropping missiles and such in that area. But this one to keep in mind here, because this would certainly enlarge the fight on that. Cyber attacks. This is one thing the Russians are very good at. We've been experiencing this for years. We're almost always constantly under cyber attacks in some shape or form. But understand, it can be much worse. And so this is the other equivalent of weapons of mass destruction that are out there. So you should understand is that a good part of our infrastructure has some degree of infiltration of Russian cyber capabilities. So if they want to shut off our power, shut off your sanitation, cause a nuclear reactor to melt down, and they have that capacity to do that. And this is one of the downsides of Snowden's defection a few years back, is he gave up the keys to the kingdom to Russia of many of the things that we had penetrated on that side. So that is just the equivalent of a nuclear weapon as far as an American be concerned, and we're very vulnerable to this. And so while we have some capacity to do this to Russia, that's a challenge as well. The other problem, potential threat, is a protracted conflict. And we're kind of starting to see a little bit of this right now, is that we may find them try to just dig in and hunker down, hold the area they have, repopulate those areas with friendly civilians, and that we're in this for a little while. The other one is they're successful in some shape or form, have a control of Ukraine, and then there would be an insurgency. And I'll guarantee you, we have CIA in country right now in Ukraine that's getting them ready to fight an insurgency, and it would be just like the Afghans fighting the Soviets years gone by. And that we would support such an insurgency against the Russians. Now, remember, this is a large country. There is no way that Russia can effectively occupy all of Ukraine. And they know if they put a puppet government in and they pull out, that puppet government will be overthrown immediately. So that's kind of the quandary the Russians are looking at right now, because again, they went in with the original assumption that Ukraine was a house of cards and would collapse as soon as they showed up. And that didn't happen. And they're in plan B right now, which is ugly with a capital U on that. So question is, with all this I've just talked about, who wins? Well, this is who wins. We are already a declining power. this will drain us even further. Russia will certainly be a shadow of what it once was, no matter how this thing turns out. And the one that's truly going to win in this conflict will be the PRC on that end. And so, ladies and gentlemen, that ends my formal presentation. I throw it open to questions.
Patrick, thank you so much. Can you hear me?
I can. Let me stop the share of the slides here so I can see people here. Okay.
We already have somebody in here with a question, and I passed around a basket in church saying, if you want to have a question, either come into the library so that they can ask it. Because for some reason you can't hear them from the church, or
Okay.
write the question. So we already have one question. And so Greg, you want to pull up and.
Yeah. Hi, Patrick. That was an excellent presentation. I really enjoyed it. Thanks.
Thank you.
I don't know if you had seen a recent article by Andrew Basovich. I think I'm pronouncing his name
Yes.
right.
Mhm.
And he spoke about a model of moral realism that looked at the model of Austria in neutrality. I was just wondering if you had any thoughts about that in terms of a solution.
Well, I had not read his article. I respect his writings. I've read quite a bit about him, and matter of fact, he lost a son in Iraq. But the closest, I think, I think what we're referring to is like a Finlandization, making it like Finland, and President Zelensky had already indicated, hey, yeah, we're not planning to apply to NATO anymore on that point, and trying to throw that bone out. But I think the complication is going to be is territory. Even if Russians fell back to the previous controlled territories of where they still have the Crimea and the eastern occupied regions, I think the Ukrainians would find that unsatisfactory, and I don't see the Russians easily giving up on the Crimea, and so I think coming into some neutrality type of position, I'm just not sure how they're going to do that unless Ukraine comes off of just giving up the Crimea area. And so this is the big challenge of all this is, how Putin can't be completely and utterly defeated and lose all that face. I mean, he's essentially a dictator, and so he just can't do that. He's got to have some kind of a win coming out of this thing. And I'm not sure where they're going to find that mutually exclusive win-win for both Russia and Ukraine.
Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick. And I have another question here. This is Frank.
Hi, Patrick.
Yes.
One wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
So you talked about the possibility of Russian use of chemical and tactical nuclear weapons. What are our options if that happens?
Well, it's a challenge. My belief, if we're really serious about this is just Pat Swinney's opinion. President Biden has not given me a call on this, but I would move forces into Ukraine in the areas that the Russians aren't in right now, and declare that a peacekeeping zone. And this is what Russia would do, and so then show the stability of Ukraine that you can't go any further. This is it. And now it's a gamble, and but at the end of the day, if they use chemical weapons, what else can you do? We will not. Again, we don't have chemical weapons. No one in the West has chemical weapons. We have some in the depots we're still trying to destroy, but but an attack nuke, same thing. Is that what are we going to do? And so I think I believe that's the only physical thing that we can do to say, okay, no more. We're here, and we're putting ourselves at risk, and we're putting NATO at risk, and we're putting the world at risk. But at the end of the day, if we let him get away with that, what's next? He'll be doing that somewhere else too. So.
Yeah. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Patrick. We have a couple of hands up. I see Gary Zartarian's hand up.
Fire away.
Patrick, thank you for the presentation. It was very informative. My question is that the United States and NATO is completely announced that they're in a defensive position here, and it's very difficult to keep playing defense. And Putin is using his threat of nuclear warfare as extorting a continued defensive position, and it seems to me that continuing to try and play defense and allowing that extortion to continue is not a strategy that we can continue using. I'd like your comments on that.
Well, I don't disagree. I mean, at the end of the day, if he does not use those weapons, I would say, other than us continue to provide weapons, defensive weapons to support Ukraine, that's all we're going to do on the battlefield itself. And we are, there's no way, that's the challenge with the alliance. You have to get the agreement of all members of the alliance if you're going to do some offensive operation. And trust me, I was the war planner for Kosovo, and that was not an easy feat. To convince nations that are far removed from the Balkans to say, and tell me again why I should be interested in this. And so I would say that's just the nature of the alliance. I think we'll be in a defensive posture unless they cross a threshold that we believe is just too far. And I think weapons of mass destruction would be that. If it's not that, it's nothing then. And then we're all we're out there to do now is just support NATO nations, and the other ones, gosh, I hope it works out for you. That's what it'll be. So that'd be unfortunate, but I think that's a challenge. I mean, your assessment's exactly correct. You don't win wars by being on the defense, but this is the quandary we're in.
Thank you, Patrick. I see also Nicholas DeCanto has a question.
Hello there, Patrick. Great presentation.
Thank you.
Especially for 30 minutes of a 30+ day war going on. Quick question is, I'll preface by saying Mr. Austin and General Milley both felt that Ukraine would fold in 3 or 4 days. Can Ukraine win this war?
It really depends on what you define win as. First of all, I don't think Putin is going to lightly give up of where he is, but he may change his goals. And as I mentioned earlier, clearly one goal he has to have out of this is that land bridge from Russia to the Crimea. And he is occupying most of that right now. And so win might be, from a Russian perspective, that, hey, I've got that land bridge I've got, and I still have the Crimea, and so okay, for now we're okay. And that might be his win. That's not a win at all for Ukraine. They're essentially sealed off from the Black Sea. And major economic aspects of what's left of those cities that are in that area that have been destroyed. But can they win? I think they can drive him to that point, i.e., that he was not successful in overthrowing the government of Ukraine and occupying Kiev. But I don't know. It'll be interesting to see how that works out. But it'll have to be. Putin's going to have something to show for this investment that he can broadcast as, this was my goal all the time in order to get that.
Alrighty, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Patrick. I have a question, and that is, what can a community of faith respond? What can we be doing?
Well, I would certainly provide any economic support you can to this refugee situation. I mean, this is so dramatic, and it is overwhelming these smaller nations that are taking on these Ukrainians that are coming in. And I personally have given to the World Central Kitchen, which is interestingly, through TripAdvisor, you can go to, and they will send this donation. And the World Central Kitchen feeds the refugees, and TripAdvisor matches all donations going to that organization. But there are plenty of other organizations that are out there doing relief operations for the Ukrainians. And clearly, as spiritual people, we should all be praying for the Ukrainians, because they need all the help they can get, and to find some peaceful solution here.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? I don't know who is in the sanctuary. If you have any questions, feel free to come into the library. Are there any other questions on Zoom? Nobody. Okay. Well, Patrick, thank you so much for your time. So good to see you, and thank you for providing this. I don't know how you managed to do that in a half an hour. This in-depth perspective that really gives. I know for me, it gave a much broader perspective and understanding of what was going on. So, so thank you so much, and
Come back soon.
come back soon. Maybe you can give us monthly updates. And I'm glad you joined us for worship. And I again apologize for our technical difficulties.
Well, I believe it was the Russians and cyber attack, and that's what we'll go.
I was thinking that when you were doing that. I was thinking all these hybrid challenges. Yep, that's what we have. So thank you so much, and goodbye to everybody.
Okay. Bye
Thank
all.
Thanks for setting this up. Yeah.